appreciate, again, your coming, and let's jump into some questions and get this conversation going. So the first thing I wanted to do, I'd like to kind of divide these questions into three areas, and I'll probably lose control within about 30 seconds. But the goal is to kind of see if we can get some definition. I think if we talk to 10 different people, we'll get 10 different definitions of what co-opetition is. Competing and cooperating at the same time, but once we drill down just a little bit below the surface, we'll find a lot of disagreement. So I'd like to see if we can get some kind of ground-setting framework and definition to what co-opetition is, and maybe a little bit of historical perspective on it. And Michael, if I can start with you, and perhaps you can also add a little bit of how this came about in your historical perspective at Novell.
Sure. I'm sitting here with very large companies to my right. And, we have 50 people at Mirage, but that's been sort of my choice over the years, and so it's interesting in that I've ended up building and rebuilding relationships over the years as part of doing this. But I think if I go back to Novell, when Ray introduced this immediately, this was 1989 when I joined the company. He'd just come out of Chapter 11, Safeguard Scientific, and so it helped him lift out of that and then gone public again for the second time. And it was originally Novell Data Systems, and Ray was the guy that was hired to do that by Safeguard. And they introduced this new version of network called Network 3, and that was the first platform for network computing. So the idea was that you could now run applications on a server. And if you rolled your clocks back that far, it was also the time when things like OS2 and Microsoft MS-DOS, as we had to call it then, were competing aggressively. And so we had Presentation Manager and Windows, and there were a lot of sort of new competitive environments. There were half a dozen database companies like Informix, in addition to Oracle, that were, at least at that time, any one of which could have achieved the scale that Oracle did. And it was sort of the new horizontal world, right? We had just gotten away from mini computers, or we were emerging from mini computers and now building a horizontal world as opposed to a vertically integrated world on top of platforms. And the charter of Ray hired a team of 12 people to do business development, or strategic alliances. And this was separate from the pure partner program stuff, sort of the standard, if I wanted to write to an API that existed already. So this was we're going to go find them kind of group, as opposed to they were going to come find us kind of group. And some, there's obviously a big difference in those two roles. And we had 4 engineers and 8 business folks in that group. There were a lot of thought about how the company culture, and one of the cultural elements that Ray put around the business was building an industry around Novell. The idea of the cash register rings when you're asleep, which was a channel thought, obviously, in terms of, I think Bill Gates is quoted as saying you could buy netware in more places than you could buy a Slurpee. Which I think was true at one point. There was something like 15,000 resellers. Some more than there were 7-Elevens in the world. But this idea of building an industry said that the charter of this organization was to go out and build relationships with companies that were either directly competitive with some parts of our business. So Oracle was an example. We had a database business that some might sneeze at, but it was a pretty substantial business in the ISAM class with Btrieve, and there were thousands of developers writing applications to it. We had a business doing SMA connectivity, and we partnered with IBM, who was obviously in the business of doing SMA connectivity. In fact, IBM resold the Novell product at the same time that it was reselling LAN server, which was an OS2-based product from Microsoft, cooperatively with Microsoft. And so the whole philosophy, and I think the reason that Ray was credited with it, although anytime I heard people ask him about it, he would disclaim that he ever created the term. He certainly used it extensively. It was really around this idea that we just have to figure out how to get along as an industry and how to build relationships despite those, what I'll call first-order competitive relationships, the cooperative relationships between direct competitors. and Oracle and IBM obviously being an example of that in the present time. Whether they are visible on day one when the relationship is put together, or as with maybe with identity, where they emerge over time, where all of a sudden somebody buys a company, all of a sudden's recent acquisition of MySQL that now puts Sun and Oracle in a competitive posture as well as a collaborative posture. They both need each other desperately. And ultimately it comes down to what does the customer want, right? And I think that was the driving force behind everything we were doing. And so we spent time building relationships with Oracle, and I was co-located with the database business at Novell, so I made a lot of really nice enemies, and about 200 people that were in the same building as me who thought I was the evil incarnate. But the idea that you could go out and build these first order competitive relationships or coopetition relationships was a key part of Ray building an environment around Novell that gave us a larger than life image, that gave us obviously new reasons for people to buy the total solution, and ultimately build a total solution out to the market. But in the process of doing that, we also discovered that there was this thing that I'll call second order cooperative relationship, which is that not only was I working with my competitor, but I was working with two partners who were themselves competitors. And so I would go to Oracle and say, would you please do a thing that we ultimately called Oracleware, which was ultimately sort of an anti-Microsoft play. And then the same, in the next breath, I'd be talking to Informix about having their product run on top of NetWare as well. And in fact, we would do trade shows where they would both be sponsors. And so you get into conversations about how do you manage that? What's the Chinese wall? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with where one of those partners wants to do more than the other one? Where Oracle wants us to do something special, but that whatever we're learning from that experience is now going to go to the benefit of Informix. Right? So how do you deal with that sort of process? Do you tell both of them, no, we won't do either one, and we'll just keep raising the bar and allow both of you to compete evenly? Or do you do what I call squeaky wheel, where you work with, you let the one who wants to move most aggressively drive that aggressive motion, and let the other guy follow and give the benefit to the one who wants to move more aggressively? Either one of those strategies has its own complexity. So those second order problems that we all live in if we have partner programs or alliance programs are interesting and challenging. When every time you do a press release and you're about to put out, and you're at A&D and you're about to put out a press release and you want to do it with two partners that are both competitors, you have to ask yourself, how much is this going to upset them? And so that second order problem is very real. I think there are probably also other things. I think the only other thing I would throw out there in terms of, as I've spent 5 years doing that and moved on to Tivoli, and obviously we went through it all over again at Tivoli, both with in amongst ourselves, and then eventually with IBM, obviously inside IBM, where we were, our strongest platform was Solaris and Sonos, and the AIX people who were in Austin hated us, and didn't understand why that was true. They didn't understand they were third in terms of the first software vendor point of view, and they thought we were part of the reason for that. So you get into all those kinds of issues. But I think there were two other things I would just throw out that I'd be interested in as we go down the line here. One is standards also introduce an interest in cooperative context, because standards communities are almost in and of themselves, by definition, full of competitors, just because those are the people who are smart in that particular area. And standards can be what some call smoke-filled rooms, right? Which is where there are even standards bodies which are sort of formal, like IEEE, where the rules are supposedly even for all players, and smoke-filled rooms where the rules are biased. And so an example of that, at least in the history, was things like WS Star, where certain people have more equal than others, right, in some sense. And those obviously create cooperative both pressures and environments that are interesting to deal with. So I don't know if that's what you wanted.
Yes, thank you. That's a good start. And please, anybody jump in. I will just kind of go down the line, but if anybody's got a salient comment based on what Michael said, or at any point, let's just make this free flow. Hearing none, Larry, I know you've got some perspective there.
I don't know how salient it's going to be, but I will say that I'm compelled to respond to your introduction of me. It was the most outrageous introduction I've ever heard. If anybody thinks my job is to control Andy Bailey,
Did I say that?
You said my job is to manage Andy Bailey. I'm going to the Mideast to create peace over there. This term, coopetition, I got to believe that the relationship between IBM and Oracle is, if it isn't, I can't find a benchmark that's more demonstrative of coopetition, because both companies cast very large shadows over the marketplaces that we operate in, and much of the shadows that we cast overlap each other, and you can historically say that there's a visceral reaction that happens in each company's sales force when you mention the other guy. So coopetition, we jokingly say in IBM, it's how to slow dance and box with the same partner at the same time. I say what it means to us is my responsibility as the relationship owner between the two companies on the IBM side is I have responsibility for all IBM brands, which for us is the systems group that is the platforms. It's the software group and the middleware and the database and that whole portfolio of software, and it is the services. And then there's another aspect that says we also have a huge shared marketplace where IBM platforms are deployed on Oracle technologies beyond their applications business, their technologies, and so to make sure that we keep that enabled. So if you want to say what does coopetition mean to us, it means we have a responsibility to our company, and we have, even more importantly, a responsibility to our shared customer set. That if you're looking for kind of the sizing of this, the number is growing through Oracle's acquisitions, but it's there's, which by the way, I don't know what the end game is. We're trying to keep our stock price as high as it can be, so we can't get bought by Larry Ellison.
I did pretty good today. I wasn't going to say that. First of all, I wanted to thank IBM for hosting us, but I also did want to congratulate you guys too on the great earnings today. I was expecting the way the stock ran up after hours it could be served in champagne when I'm a little disappointed.
Yeah.
But I'm probably one of the least experienced alliance professionals in this room, in that I moved into alliances less than 3 years ago, after spending most of my career in professional services, most of that with Oracle Consulting. And so my exposure to alliances has been at Oracle, and being in alliances at Oracle, coopetition is synonymous with alliances. It is just the way we do business, because any company, and most of the companies in this room, if you're a multi-product or with the services, there are people in your ecosystem that you will both partner with and compete with. It's just the nature of the business. When you get beyond, you just don't get the people. But we just have to operate in that environment. That's exactly what we do with IBM. We just recognize that we compete, but we also recognize just as much that there are areas where we can take a differentiated value proposition to market by partnering and drive both of our revenues higher as a result of that. And over the past 2.5 years, it's been my pleasure working with Larry, and I think we've actually been able to do some things between the two companies, certainly the companies hadn't done before. That Larry said he'll explain everything to you this evening.
Well, I mean, just following Andy's point, I think the obligation that we have to our company first is to maximize, for us, is to maximize IBM's performance around the relationship we have and the ecosystem opportunity that Oracle presents in the marketplace. And I think Andy and his team and what he represents have the same role. So it's, in having said that, we have an obligation to try and create where can we maximize our value, and at the same time we have to contain the dark side of that, which is the competitive section. And so the most important element, and Mike said earlier when he mentioned customers or clients, the clients are not an interruption to our routine. They're why we exist. And so if you look at the Oracle acquisition stream over the last 2.5 years, they've acquired somewhere in the neighborhood of between 15 and 20,000 customers that are using some version of Oracle applications with some component of IBM technology and or services. So those are 20,000 customers who have made very serious decisions somewhere along the line as to whose technology and whose application they're going to implement. And the fact that we are doing what we do through acquisitions and mergers, and that's all important to us and our stockholders and our employees. But that client out there is sitting there saying, you guys got to get this figured out because your decisions impact my ability to progress my business. And so that's where Coopetition gets nailed right on the head is, help protect my investments. Give me the choices I need and want so that I can make informed decisions about whose applications I deploy and whose technologies I deploy on. You guys figure that out, but don't put me in the penalty box as a result of what you're doing. And I think that's what we kind of have to keep reminding ourselves of.
Well, I agree. And I think when for the companies that we represent, the footprint is so large that it's hard to, align strategically on a long-term basis with any, one organization and think that'll last, forever because the market does change, acquisitions do happen. And I think in the end, and a lot of us have probably been in this situation where we're really, put a lot of energy into creating, the best joint value prop, and then we take it to market, and then, you take it to a customer who says, well, I want that piece, but I want that other piece from another organization. So it also means, being flexible, because in the end, the customer is going to have the final decision on, what that partnership is, what they run or, how it fits into their business.
Thank you. I'd like to take a little more industry-oriented perspective for a minute and get your thoughts on this. Over the last 20 years or so, it seems, and Pete, you've all touched on this in one way or another, it seems that this has become, Coopetition has become a more prevalent issue, a more complex issue, and I'm wondering why that is the case. What is it about the industry that's driving us towards more and more alliances with people that we have to worry about competition with? And related to that, in the fields of business development and alliance management, is it driving a change in those professions and how they're managed?
I'm sure there's other folks on the panel that answer the question, but I think you stage the question as an issue. And personally, I don't think it is an issue. I think it's just the way that we do business. As long as we recognize that we compete in certain elements of our business, we don't see that, we don't see IBM as an issue. We see opportunity in areas where we don't compete. And it's just a normal mode of operation. And I just think that using the term issue, in my, opinion, really just tarnishes the question a little bit in that I don't see it that way myself.
Would you agree with, say, kind of an increased mode of complexity?
I think it's a mode of alliance. I mean, it's one of the kinds of alliances that we have. It's the only one that I've ever had exposure to. But, and maybe that's because I don't see it as an issue.
I think the markets have consolidated. HP bought Compaq, bought Tandem.
Right.
So there are fewer organizations competing for the same business. So, where you could have had 10 hardware companies to choose from, now, you have some subset of that. And the same thing with the services organizations. There were a lot more, but now as the market changes and work moves offshore, the organizations consolidate. So I think, I agree with Andy. It'd be nice if we didn't have to deal with it, but it is kind of part of the day-to-day. And I think we all strive to try to find where we can have a win-win partnership. but, be open-minded and flexible for when, there is a conflict, and, you manage that as hopefully more on the one-off basis and not as how you, drive your business or focus your business.
That's a very interesting perspective. That it's the consolidation that's driving it rather than the plethora of new companies that are rising up from the bottom that require coupling at various levels to get to competitive positions. I think that's a very interesting perspective. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think I'm going to show my age here. If you roll the clock back to the days when Big Blue was Big Blue, and I don't mean Cisco, because today it seems like it means Cisco. I don't know why that is anymore. Maybe that's because I'm in the networking business. But if you go back to that environment, everything was vertically integrated. The only place you could get a database that ran on your 370 or whatever was from IBM. The only way you get an application that ran on that environment for the most part was from IBM. And the same thing was true in the mini computer environment in the 80s, and then that started to change, and we ended up with this environment where all of a sudden we turned the world on its side 90 degrees, and we started buying each component and building it sort of ourselves. Right? So you could buy a chip from somebody, and then you could buy a motherboard from that would create a motherboard, and you get different motherboards and build a PC, and you get different operating systems for the PC, you get different window environments for the PC, and you get different databases for that environment. And so all these companies that were formed around that model, and so you created a horizontally integrated model that Andy Grove really set out to achieve, I think, around the Intel architecture. And then the consolidation happened. And so before the consolidation happened, there was a certain amount of that competition, but it was not as extensive. And then the consolidation started to occur, and database companies started to buy identity management companies, and identity management companies started to buy database companies, and systems companies started to buy everything, and now you end up with that environment. So I agree with Andy that it is just a fact of life, even in a 50-person company. I mean, we partner with companies that have, at least believe they have, even if they don't profess, and maybe profess they have, even if we don't believe they have aspects of what we do, and yet we have to work with them in customer environments. So even in that small environment. But to your point, John, I think that there is this constant sort of creation of new technology. You take an environment like Google, and it didn't exist 6 or 7 years ago, however long Google's been around. It hasn't been very long. And you create this massive amount of value in a very quick period of time, and all of a sudden Microsoft has a new competitor out there. And yet they have to partner because they have to run in those environments, they have to run in Internet Explorer, they have to, and so there's an engine fueling that underneath that changes, sort of stirs the pot, right? And so you end up with different mixtures all the time. So acquisition is kind of the thing that keeps it exciting, I guess, because 7 years ago, you guys weren't competitors in identity management. So Tivoli didn't view Oracle as a competitor. Now, you clearly do. Right? And so you've got one less little box that you could play in, right? And so that's I guess, what keeps the job interesting.
Well, acquisitions and consolidation can be driven by a couple of motivations. One could be just to get beyond organic growth, to just get growth through acquisition. I think the issue that's on the table is, what does a company represent to the marketplace in terms of its value to the end user client? And so if you take Oracle as an example, 3 years ago, Oracle was primarily, not that they weren't in the application business, but they certainly were, but they certainly weren't known as a huge middleware company. And so to grow their business and to create shareholder value and intrinsic value to the marketplace, Oracle has embarked on a path to grow their application side and aggressively grow their middleware and their database, and integrating technologies so that you optimize all of them and say, whose railroad would you rather ride on? It's a very similar strategy that IBM embarked on. 10 years ago, we said, we are not going to own the application. We're going to partner with application vendors to take the application to market. We're going to leverage our technologies around that. So when an IBM company goes that way, an Oracle company creates value through a similar thing, all of a sudden you find yourself overlapping in things that are strategically important to each company.
John, are you ready for the question?
If it's okay, unless it's really burning, can you mark it down and hold it towards the end?
Who's it for?
It's for you, Ann.
I can offer you paper.
A very interesting set of responses. I'm hearing consolidation and emerging technologies and kind of the fluidity within consolidating companies, kind of all creating this kind of new environment.
But for perspective, I think that IBM and Oracle overlapped in far more businesses, as Larry pointed out, than we did 5 years ago or 3 years ago. But we've never actually had a stronger alliance. And I think just because...
Other than leadership, what's that?
I missed the question. What's the question?
You said we've never had a stronger alliance.
I'll leave it at that. No, but what I would say is the alliance, but if we took a perspective a couple of years ago, even though we are competing more in those areas, that the perspective that we took is that a strategic alliance is just not a holistic corporate agreement. It's a set of very specific initiatives, and the alliance is made up of a set of very specific value propositions and initiatives that you do together that drive value into the marketplace. Any one of those things may change over time. If it's identity management, it can drop out. It doesn't impact, to a great extent, the overall value of the alliance because we have multiple of those initiatives in different areas. And those can change over time. And what we found is we've actually worked hard to add even more of those initiatives, even though we compete more than we ever did.
That's a perfect segue. My next question, thank you. I wanted to start looking at some of the strategic evaluations that you go through in choosing alliances that may have cooperative aspects to them, or in an alliance you currently are working with, how do you go to the next incremental program? How do you decide which products you're going to connect up, which is partly, I think, Andy, what you were talking about. So what I wanted to get at in general is, as you're doing your strategic planning and your business evaluation of who to partner with or what's the next program with the current partner, how do you go about that? How do you make the analysis of how you can grow the pie larger and still make your cut of it come out better for you? Anybody jump in?
Well, I think, when we manage the partnerships, and having worked at Oracle for 12 years, you look for the market opportunity and the revenue opportunity that two organizations think that they can both work together and achieve as a goal. And, or, one side looks for the right partner to go to market with. And then you kind of craft a value proposition around that. And then, you execute and you focus. And it might mean that you're working with, a part of Oracle, where you align, but there are other segments of Oracle where you might compete. And the same thing, with IBM. I mean, PwC, wasn't a non-compete with IBM up until October, but now we could potentially compete. But there was an opportunity that came up, a couple months ago where IBM is a prime in a particular client, and PwC brings some specific expertise, and in that case, will be a sub, to IBM. So I think, you can build initiatives around a market opportunity, and then, kind of put a lock on that and execute on it, and that's how, you could put a portfolio of those different initiatives together to, that assembled make up a strategic relationship.
I take a very simplistic approach in our planning that says, come out from the aspect of where are we underserved in terms of our performance versus the market? Where do we see areas that we can gain share in the marketplace as a result of two companies working together? So it's got to be incremental. It doesn't do us any good if we move $1 of revenue from an IBM SAP relationship to an IBM Oracle relationship. It's got to be incremental revenue to both companies. And so Oracle's been very, to Andy's point, Oracle's been very adaptive in building out their strategy one industry at a time. We're organized similarly by industry. So it makes a great opportunity for synergy where you can say these two companies pick the industry are underserved in this, and we're not growing as fast as the industry. And so if we combine the two companies and figured out a value proposition to take a solution to market, could we gain share? At the same time, to the cooperative, whatever it is.
Michael can pronounce it.
We have got to make sure that we understand that there will be a point in time where we both take a solution to market. Oracle will want to sell it on their technology base, and we'll want to sell it on our technology base. And so we have to manage to that environment. It's not easy. It requires constant touch and one that we always have to worry about. But for us, I think it's all about increments. Where can we go gain share?
Well, and I think that's what we spend a lot of our time on is alliances, is trying to identify those areas of incremental value. And, in companies as large as ours, that is a full-time job because there are lots of opportunities and certainly the rate of acquisition that we've made. But what we look for, and the ideas can percolate from many different sources. They can come from a client win, which is often a good one if we've actually done something together in the field together that was successful. Clearly, we want to be able to replicate that, so that's a good source. But as a life professional, those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. But ultimately, the acid test is if we're going to have a strategic alliance or initiative around a particular industry or micro vertical. If we go to market together with some assets and some point of view, is 1 plus 1 going to equal 2 or is it going to equal 3? And the answer has to be, in the mind of the customer, 1 plus 1 equals 3 when we actually take that value proposition. And that's what we look for.
Is it true that 1 plus 1 has to equal 3? Still has to be greater
more than 2.
More than 2. What after you subtract out what you may be losing out of some of the competitive aspects of that?
Well, you're looking for in order for it to equal 3, there has to be something unique about the value proposition. So it has to be an Oracle product combined with an IDF product, with an IDF service, and it's got to be able to address a particular pain point by industry. And by the definition of being unique, really you actually come together and partner with that partner to take something to market that is really different. And of course what you're trying to do is you're trying to move much further forward in the customer's buying cycle by proactively going out to the customer base and saying, hey, look what we've done together. And, to me, that's the real key here. It's not about just engaging once an RFPs come out and going to the customer and saying, hey, look, we're partners. But, you're lucky if it equals 2 at that point. So, that's what we look for.
Our company has consistently been faced with acquisitions setting that scenario near 70 or 80% of the way through the go-to-market planning and all the development work and all of the relationship building. And then boom, an acquisition comes in completely.
That's why I'm a believer in, if you can't execute, put a plan together and execute within maybe 6 months, yeah. If it takes, and I've lived through this where, you want to build something, unique and it's going to be special and you try to get the funding on both sides and the contracts. That's 2 years later, and then, everything kind of fizzles and nobody's bought anything and nobody has revenue to show. So, yeah, it kind of has to, have a lot of momentum behind it for it to be successful, is my experience.
No, we're not taking questions. What degree is the M&A activity aligned with or in communication with any of you folks?
Johnny's wall question.
I'm not sure.
Well, you're learning. If I can rephrase, you're learning. Each of you is learning about the other's business when you go out and do these go-to-market. If it's that successful, you might go, maybe I want to do some of that myself.
So, what happens when the M&A group or the product management group is targeting an acquisition, which is inherently a very secretive process. And you guys are more, from my perspective, you're developing new initiatives because you see the same gap with the same opportunity. And so you're addressing it through an alliance. Meanwhile, M&A is going after another company that's going to address it. And so your efforts will be upended.
I'll be lying if I say it doesn't happen. Sometimes you do those things in parallel, but again, in some ways it's unavoidable. And I don't know what's done.
I'll give you a great example of what you just said. IBM had very strong, and still has very strong relationships with Hyperion and Business Objects, and we just acquired Cognos. I mean, that's the manifestation of what you just described, right? So when the acquisition of Cognos is completed, did we stop what we were doing with Oracle and Hyperion or SAP and Business Objects? No, we did not. Where you see the differentiation is for an IBM company, you won't see an ad in the Wall Street Journal touting IBM and SAP on a Business Objects platform or IBM and Oracle on a Hyperion platform. But you will very much see us working together to optimize our platforms and our services. And customers who are deploying either those using IBM software technologies, we're going to work together to protect that customer footprint. But it is the world. So to answer your question, I think you were asking, we are more reactive than proactive to that kind of scenario.
Yeah, I think, an observation as sort of the guy who isn't working inside of what I would describe as a well-structured relationship that exists between Oracle and IBM is that there's clearly, for that to work, or indeed any of the BMC relationships, and I've had some of those too, including with Tivoli at one point in time, which was a very interesting dance, and it is that you have to have that very strong executive sponsorship. If Sam and Larry don't get along and don't have the ability to communicate and sort of drive the reason for you guys to exist, they could decide one day that that's all a waste of time to stop, right? And then you might upset a lot of customers, but there are certainly vendors. I'm not suggesting IBM has that or Oracle has that DNA, but there are certainly vendors that do. You might at some point just decide that that's not the way they're going to operate anymore. And it's that executive sponsorship, I think, that ultimately allows you to live through all of those perturbations, and probably to have the Chinese wall that would allow you to be spending a lot of time in cycles building a relationship-based opportunity where you're really catching up to.
The customers came, at the end of the day, no customer is going to let one company be so dominant. You end up with companies who are underperforming when you let that happen.
As soon as we say we're going to have a alliance with somebody, the phone will be...
Yeah, the phone rings. Yeah, right. Yeah. So the customer, I think, that ultimately helps. But it does take a lot of executive sponsorship. I think the challenge as a small vendor, you've got a trust model that you've built, whether it's on a human level between individuals or between the companies or several people within the companies. The challenge for a small vendor in doing it is that even though I've probably called on Oracle many, many times before to try and build a relationship, it's a new one each time, and there's a new Andy signature ready for fun when I do it. Quite often he seems to have a British accent, but we were talking about that earlier. But you don't have the trust model. So in my case, I have cooperative relationships with sort of companies like McAfee and Symantec, or I'm trying to build them in that they both play in segments of the space that I'm trying to build out for myself. And so not only do you have to go through the things that we talked about there, you have to, first of all, the vendor may not have the DNA that Oracle and IBM have, which is to think through this in a very professional way and do it from the perspective of the customer. There are a lot of vendors out there that don't have, in my experience, don't have that DNA. That don't, if you approach them and you compete with any part of their business, even though it would add value to another part of their business, they don't know how to process that. Well, there may be a human in that company that does, but it's really hard to find them, put it that way.
I'm curious how prevalent that is. Can I be so bold as to say, can we have a poll in here?
I bump into it quite a bit in vendors, and if you're lucky, you find the one person who says, "This is the way, I don't know how to work with you. My partner program doesn't understand the fact that you can operate." But I'd be interested in.
Well, I'm in the consulting business, so I talk with a lot of companies, and I find it's very true, particularly with smaller companies, because many founders and senior executives don't understand the competition model. Companies such as Oracle and IBM is exactly why. Don't know how to manage alliances and what you do in a day-to-day business. I would be probably the very few alliances where there isn't an overlap in some aspect. And for a lot of smaller companies, it's very problematic, not because the alliance managers don't understand, but their managers don't understand.
And yet, I'm also in the consulting business, and I agree with you. It's scaling. Smaller businesses can't do that because they need the revenue. And then it's also almost by types of institutions, because I also consult to the Department of Defense and the Marine Corps, as well as to state governments. And they're so split into separate units, they're actually internally incented to not integrate their systems. In terms of the SI world, they're incented to not integrate, and they actually incent their vendors to not integrate, and they incent their vendors to try to do a single SI winner. So it's by scale, and it's also by type of institution, whether the institution can really act like an institution or not. And there are plenty of corporations out there that literally functionally can't act like integrated institutions. They're still really incenting separate profit units in a way that they say, I need you want to do. Don't you think you can probably grab this
Another
by
good segue
size?
to what I'd like to move on to after looking at the strategic component a little bit is what I think is the hard part, which is how do you implement on this? How do you set up the rules of engagement? And more importantly, as importantly, how do you make them work between companies and as importantly within your own companies and especially with your field sales force? So what are the rules of engagement that are important to set up? And how do you manage them?
Well, first of all, let's be honest with each other. In the world we live in, we can have these intergalactic love fests and we can say what we do. But the coin operated device is the salesperson in the territory who knows how he or she gets paid. In our world, an IBM database specialist or an Oracle technology salesperson, those guys don't trust the other. Because they're sure if they bring our hardware guy in that he's going to have a software guy on his hip, and we feel exactly the same way about them. That's at the field level. You got to manage that, and so it takes. For us, we have a set of operating principles that says what are we going to do and how are we going to operate. And when Andy says we create a relationship or an initiative, we have a set of operating principles or assumptions around how we're going to take that solution to market. And we have a clear escalation process owned by line executives all the way to the top of both businesses. If we can't resolve it, we have a clear escalation path as to how to get those things resolved. There is a lot of conditioning that has to happen of your field sales force and the marketplace. And we have a very clear sales enablement or conditioning or education process that we do to train our field and educate them and make them aware. And we use their assets to help train our field, and they use our assets to help train their field as to what it is. So that what we're really trying to do is not only have a set of operating principles and rules of engagement, but more importantly, in a cooperative environment, is to build trust. That's the hardest thing to do, is to build trust. And what you find is your competition will always try and tell the prospect that the relationship that they have with Oracle or IBM is better than the relationship that IBM and Oracle have. And so you're always fighting this battle. But I think it's hard work. It's constant work. It requires a lot of work to set the operating principles, enable your field, and reinforce it through escalation path.
I agree 100%. And we have the governance model at the sort of corporate level, but that's not the thing that's key to making the alliance work. It was key as a catalyst to get us onto this next phase of the alliance 2 or 3 years ago. But what's key now is the alignment around, as Larry said, at the line exec level. It's the talking between our head of retail and the IBM head of retail in a particular geography, knowing that they have a value proposition that they can take to market together. That is why it works. And that's where the rules of engagement are defined at that level. We can't define rules of engagement at the corporate level. They're going to work in every one of those industries and geographies. We would be foolish to try. But what we can do is set in place a mechanism, get the alignment around the value proposition at the line exec level, and help them craft some rules of engagement about what happens in certain scenarios, and also help them with the enablement, the empowerment, the sales kits and other things, so that they can actually go out and drive more business together.
How do you know you can achieve that when you set up this initiative?
Well, IBM and Oracle have an alliance for a long time, and they're actually worked on that alliance for a long time. We did about 3 years ago. I think it was an inflection point, when we acquired PeopleSoft. We became a much more important alliance partner, and we actually took that as a wake-up call or a catalytic event, if you like, to get together at the corporate level and say, how can we drive more business together? We're going to compete. We've had a long-standing alliance, but it's been a fairly tactical alliance. What can we do together? And we picked, at that point, at the corporate level, we said, here's some areas where we think we can drive more business together. We picked a couple of areas, and we got the line execs together. We forced them to, and what we've seen is, traction around those things. Not all of them have been successful. Many, I would say, they've all taken longer to come to fruition than we anticipated when we engaged on these things almost 3 years ago. But that's how we did it.
I think the important element from an IBM perspective is line versus staff. If there's any conflict, line always wins. So the guy who's out there owns the client, owns the relationship, owns the presentation of the IBM company to the marketplace. So when we dream up something, we go back to the point about how do we gain share, how can we create a differentiating value proposition. A very critical component of that go-to-market step is to get the ownership and the buy-in by the line field executive who owns that marketplace. If they don't buy it, they don't own it, it isn't going to happen. It's not worth the powder to blow it up at that point.
Donna. And then I think, having lived through these scenarios is that as soon as you start to see, the partnering at the tactical level starting to go off course, that's when you have to kind of start the escalation process. And before it goes to gets raised. So, I agree that you need sponsorship, and management sponsorship for any initiative that you launch with another organization on both sides. And what we've done is try to put in place kind of regular touch points with the executives to kind of review how the initiative or that program is going. We've gotten the first couple of early adopters, the usually your investment, customers, and then they're your references for the next 10 opportunities that you're going to pursue. So, a regular touch point of the executive sponsors is important.
You're striving for what I would call predictable behavior that provides predictable outcomes. That's what this for us is all about. What can we expect out of each other? And when we see a violation, we've got to call it out.
Don, I'm particularly interested in how SIs deal with situations in which you're going, this is not unique to SIs, but I think it's a particularly interesting problem when you're going out into the field and you have more than one vendor that you have alliances with that are going to the same customer.
Right. Well, I think, we mentioned this, in the end, it's the customer who's going to choose the partners or the vendors that they don't, want to work with and live with.
But you need to maintain the trust of the different partners you have. And how you operate at the field.
And it's, kind of selling, so it's all personal. And the personal relationships, that's how you can make it work. And personal relationships where there's trust. I've gone through a lot of exercises where we've created these rules of engagement. Nobody really likes whipping those out and kind of going down through the checklist. And I think, if kind of at the field level, if you can kind of get that, first win, 1 or 2 wins, then we can kind of point everybody to that to say that's the model. And that's how we want to partner, and that's how we want to work together to drive that together. It's good to have governance and rules to help, provide some governance for the partnership. But in the end of the day, it's kind of professionalism and trust that, drive, more business through partnership.
More organic, bottom up, kind of, yeah. Michael, did you want to?
Well, I think I'm going to sort of reach back into some other experiences. I think the field driven, for a long time, and this doesn't matter whether it's competition or not, but from my point of view, it doesn't matter what BD people or alliance managers, whatever name you attach, dream up. If the field doesn't see any value in it, you've wasted all your time. And so part of our responsibility, no matter what it is to make sure that it can be done, that there is some rational way where 2 sales guys can work together and make it happen. And that doesn't matter whether it's competitive or not. I think, sometimes, they are coin-operated, and sometimes you can use that to your advantage and bias the behavior. And I don't know whether or not you guys do that, but it's certainly possible. Although, I know a lot of small companies will say, can I just give Visa cards to all the Oracle sales guys who sell my stuff, with $50 on them? And unfortunately, large companies frown on that.
I know a few of our sales guys $50.
Maybe 500, but the idea that you could somehow directly compensate the sales guy for a third party, piece of activity. But again, I'm speaking there from a small vendor point of view. But clearly, the sales execution is important. But I also think, Donna said this. I'll emphasize it. Even though these are very large organizations, when you get down into retail to retail, Germany to Germany, those guys know each other, and they do ultimately build relationships out there. And they will, I think, for the most part, notwithstanding the turnover in those organizations, they're going to build trust between the 2 of them, and that ultimately that is what the relationship gets based on, is that ongoing trust, to the point where when the next thing drops from the sky, the next idea that you guys come up with comes out, for them to work together, they go, yeah, I can work with Joe because it works, and it worked before, and I can trust him not to do what you just described, which is to bring in the software guy on his head.
And I think it requires communication. Whenever we engage with the whole sales team, it's like, do you have a preferred partner that you're working with already? You've got to have those conversations early, so that you can understand, if they're lost, or, going exclusive, which is kind of usually not the case. Or, at what point do you check back in to kind of assess, do you get closer in your partnership, or do you still kind of stay kind of neutral because everybody's still kind of competing for the piece?
There's an interesting dynamic that happens in the marketplace in my case. Clients, a good many of them are very smart about this. If they've got an implementation going on, and it's not going the way they wanted it to go, they will use this relationship. It's not unusual for a client to go to Oracle, up their executive team, and say, would you go work with the IBM company, because I ain't getting out of them what I'm needing. So, this is a two-way pipe here. And so it's not us always, it's the client coming back saying, I need you to work with your relationship, because the fact that you're not influencing your partner is hurting me, and therefore it's hurting our relationship. So it really is an interesting dynamic in the market.
I think a lot of it, you have to think about the timeline of a sale or a customer sale. If you're both appearing late in the sales cycle, there's multiple competitors of both of you in that account. And if that's the only time you meet, you really don't have an alliance. You may have a teaming agreement. You really don't have a strategic alliance together. So if you think about the sales cycle, if you really want to be driving new revenue together, you've got to be thinking, how do we get further forward in the customer's buying cycle. And the only way that you can do that is actually by identifying the things that bring unique value of the two of you working together and going to market around those and having the sales kit. So you're not just leaving it to those two retail guys in Germany to have trust, which is very important, but you're actually equipping them to more proactively go out together and drive new business because they have something interesting to tell the customer. And so, when I think about the more strategic nature of the alliance, it's all about how do we identify those opportunities to move further forward in the sales cycle. Just recognizing that if we come together late in the sales cycle, it's just like the dance. We'll all be sort of eyeing each other up the dance, and that's not the way we want to be.
So if I understand you right, it's about providing the tools as well as the financial incentives that work at the situation from the bottom.
Well, it's all about equipping sales guys at the end of the day on both sides with, the sales kits, the marketing overhead, the enablement, the training, the position, so that they can actually, when they're planning their accounts at that stage, they look at each other and go, we can go kill more of this pipeline, create more pipeline, get more of these deals, these opportunities by working together. And we need to be, part of our job is to make sure we're providing that information to the salespeople in those verticals or those horizontal solution areas.
Yeah, I think all the perspective on bottom-up management is important. One of the things that I found in my experience is in putting together deals, obviously it doesn't work at the field level, it doesn't work, and I found myself sometimes just frustrated that I want to go out and actually hand to the field and take a salesperson from partner A and a salesperson from partner B, send them to the local bar, give them a credit card, tell them to buy drinks, share leads, go out and make a sale, and then things will happen. So I think those are all excellent comments.
I actually have a question on that, which just comes to mind. Given the way you build that relationship, how does that? So then the HB guy comes along.
He's a good guy.
And of course, they're having the same conversation, right? And you've got some that maybe not going to be quite like them that you have to deal with on the IBM side. But there's certainly an alter ego for IBM and HP in many respects. How do you get that field guy to decide which one? I mean, do you battle it out with your colleague who manages the HP relationship, or?
The approach that I described is an approach to partner and identifying some unique value propositions. It's also about having, alliances and making sure that, we have the vehicles to work together in the field. But where we spend our time is identifying those things with HP that would allow us to go drive more business with HP or with essentially own PWs. And because not IBM is not the leader in every micro-vertical segment. Many, but if you start dissecting verticals and then you add a geography component, there are thousands of intersections, literally. And our job is we want to go find partners that can help us grow our business in all of those. And IBM, in this particular case, happens to have a lot, so we work very aggressively in a number of industry areas. And we also do the same thing with other partners, because that's how we want to go out and fill out our ability to grow together.
So it's unlikely that you'd have two conflicting conversations.
You may, but when you think about, the number, because people talk about, the problem we fall into is that, and I don't subscribe to this philosophy, you'll hear people say, well, we partner with partner X in financial services, and we go to market with financial services. Well, the challenge with that is if you dissect financial services, you can dissect it into a number of financial services, capital markets, retail banking, core banking, tier 1, 2, 3, 4 banks globally. And no one partnership is going to be addressing all of those things. And even then, the customer wants choice. So I think you've got to have a lot of those kinds of things.
I'm going to guess it is very common in this SI business. PwC is likely to have a relationship with Oracle and a relationship with SAP, and they both sides of that family are going to be engaged in a package selection.
Right.
And nobody's going to want to disengage early and disadvantage themselves, but everybody wants the most loyal. There is no cookie cutter. Everyone has to be managed individually.
Well, I mean, PwC has two strategic relationships, one with SAP and one with Oracle, so we're covering our bases. But I think, at Oracle, there is an effort to try to pick, one or two partners for any particular solution area, because one can't really maybe cover it all. So at least then you have two partners that you can kind of get as much coverage for a particular solution out of your industry. And those are the preferred partners, right?
So in a particular account, if you've got SAP on one hand and Oracle on the other hand, and you're in bidding on the same account with two different partners, how do you manage the process of Chinese walls, or what do you do to try and sort that out? To maintain the trust factor that you
Two separate teams.
Just two separate teams.
Two separate teams that don't communicate. And they work in a line as closely with that, the Oracle or the SAP to input best proposals together.
It's not uncommon, especially in public sector business where we have to have four separate teams supporting four separate proposals from four separate partners. And we just have to keep all those rules in place. So it's not an uncommon scenario.
And once you've gone to the next step and whoever's won with whoever, what are the issues of account control, account management? How do they manifest themselves? Or is that an issue? Where you've gone into a situation where you've got competitive pieces to your business, but you put together a solution for a customer. Long term, there may be ways that you may want to direct them that are more to your advantage as opposed to your partner that may want to, in managing the account, move them in another direction. Michael, I see you nodding your head.
Well, yeah, I think it has to happen, right? It's sort of the corollary to the software guy on the hip, which is he's not right on the hip, he's 6 months behind. And so you go in collaboratively on a particular initiative, retail in Germany, and put something together, and then 6 months later, you have the opportunity to sell it in management for that customer. So now you have a direct competitive relationship in there. How does the account control that initial win? And maybe it is just managed separately at that point. But it runs a lead.
Well, the escalations.
Yeah, right. I was simply paraphrasing the question, but
the reality is, I don't think any of us on this table represent companies who are going to advocate what they think is their rightful position in that account.
Right.
And so, you enter the account with a clear role to play. And IBM has a value, it provides a certain set of values, as does Oracle in an account. Over time, those values may get conflicted as the two companies evolve and build up the solution. But you just have to manage it. Both companies are going to maintain and aggressively try to maintain what they think is the control of that client as it relates to that individual company's value proposition and not advocate. Pure and simple.
I think we have to get the customer better.
That's exactly right. Customer provides adult leadership a lot.
At the end of the day, the reason why we have partnerships is so that we can have joint references. And so, the escalations do happen because, they want client X to continue to be a referenceable account. Because it doesn't do anything for the strategic level of the partnership. And if anybody in the field hears about it, they tell two friends, then we can't do any more business.
Okay, I think we have some great questions coming from the audience, and I see an eager audience, so let's start taking Q&A.
So what kind of escalations go all the way to the top? To Larry and, let's see.
I'll give you, without getting specific in terms of accounts.
Right.
Generally, it is when a client raises his hand or her hand and says, I'm in trouble because partner B is not giving me what I expected out of this relationship. And the field has tried to work in concert with who they think is their counterpart, and you're not getting the reaction or the response. And you get to a certain size client, and they have a very senior person in both companies who has that relationship that transcends the field relationship with it. And generally, that person's going to get a phone call from a customer that says, I'm in trouble, and it's in trouble because of things that either you're not providing or your partner's not providing, and I'm unable to get help, so would you go provide some leverage with your partnership?
I'd also give you a perspective. I mean, we get a lot of mistaken escalations, and the reason I say that is that in the areas where we're working together, so if we've got an initiative, like I said, a strategic alliance is made up of 7 initiatives that come and go over time to work in those. The only way those work are if there's field alignments at the executive level. Most of the escalations where you're working together can be resolved with the line executives. They're senior enough people in the organization. They know how to manage those things because, that's part of the reason they're in their job. Where we get these mistaken escalations is a rep in an industry where we really don't have an initiative. Will raise an escalation, say, hey, I thought we had a strategic relationship with IBM, and they're pushing SAP in this particular account of mine. I want Larry to call Sam, And those are kind of, we're really, and that's why it's a mistake, right?
So what happens is Andy calls Larry.
and one of us will go and talk to the rep and say,
But we all know that software projects aren't always successful. And then how do you deal with the wreckage at the end when it's a joint engagement between the two of you?
We just don't cry.
Well, I mean, then you just kind of have to kind of dissect it and, figure out how you can move forward. With, somebody committed on the other side of the partnership.
I actually think those things, I'll probably regret saying this, but I think the scenarios that where things don't get resolved and litigation is involved are very rare.
Yes.
And so I think those are just really very, very odd exceptions. Most of the time they can be worked out because we want our product, to be, speak for us all here, we want our products to be reflected in the best possible light. And most of us in here, if not all of us, will go, as far as we need to go to make sure that we rectify for that customer. That's what I think. And we work with our partners. Our partners do the same thing. So that would be my response.
I just think in the world we live in, the more, we've said it too many times, the more you can permeate your field organization with what it is you're trying to get accomplished as an alliance, and the more you can get one-on-one relationships at the field ownership, the more you can prevent that.
Yep.
And on the other hand, the more you can resolve it if you get that, because you've got enough trust that says, let's go to the next one, let's make the next one right. We have very clear examples of where we had breakage at the field level. We got field line executives talking to each other, and all of a sudden you've got a relationship that you never thought could happen. And it's all founded on success around the customer opportunity.
Don't look at me.
Anybody got a
Now
quarter?
you know where we got problems. We keep our costs down.
These momentary flashes.
We had a question.
I'd like to hear a little more elaboration on the firewall between the two companies. Obviously, Oracle and IBM are very large companies, particularly IBM. As you know, you can separate two teams, you can put sales reps and say you've got two proposals going on. But as you know, with large organizations, you have many differing metrics, and you have deal desks and proposal desks and people at the region that also get involved in big deals. How does the firewall work when you start getting up to the proposal desks and to where you may have a general manager of a country that really wants to sell more IBM, for example, but wants to work the deal with Oracle? How does it work at that level when you're getting into these these mid-tier products out in the field?
I'll just answer for us. Let's just stick with the same scenario. Oracle and SAP. It's the services arm. We have two very large, very mature, very deep benched teams supporting our relationship with Oracle. Is measured in thousands and thousands of people, and SAP similarly. So we don't share assets in that kind of.
So do you have separate deal desks?
Yep, all the way to the top, and all the way to the bottom, wherever you want to start at. Not to mention, I mean, look, there are scenarios where you've got a relationship in the field and the customer, Oracle would like us to declare them as their partner. We would like Oracle to declare. End of the day, the client wants to hear from both of you. The client, he or she wants a choice. So there's no easy solution, but in our world, firewall is pretty simple because we've made huge investments in the practices around these two relationships.
Another question?
Can all four of you describe what your discussions have been internally about how you four are going to pass along your own competency? Because it's a strategic relationship between companies, not just people. And it takes a long time to develop the competency and knowledge you've got. So you're going to go to another position, Andy, and you're going to go, Donna, to another position. So how do you literally capture your own competency and then pass along further so the companies keep having a strategic relationship? People make a difference.
Well, that's sort of the odd one out in that environment.
But you have a tremendous amount of experience at this. So
No, but it odd one out in the sense that I'm not surrounded by other people that look like me. That may be really hard, but do what I do for a living. One level it's in a small company. I don't know if it's 50 or 500. You are at a senior level. Your commitment obviously is to the CEO in my case, right? And it's that. So at one level, it's just the personal relationship, which says we're going to do this until we either tips over and dies, or we sell it for a couple $100 million, and we're going to go on and do another one. And so that's sort of the first answer. Is that probably won't happen. It's less likely to happen in our environment because of the nature of an entrepreneurial activity. But the other part of it is that you introduce other people into the equation. I mean, you've got a CEO relationship. If it's a really important relationship, I'm making sure that our CEO is involved in that relationship, and I'm guessing that's also true in that case.
So you're doing it intentionally, that there is this multi-person, intentional, strategic level linkage.
Yeah, and the attention is probably not just to preserve the knowledge, but that there's clearly value in having a CEO relationship between in addition to my relationship with I don't know, pick a company, Sophos or something, at my level, at the vice president level, and also at the CEO level. And there's value in that in and of itself, just in building that relationship as an alliance professional, as I'm sure everybody knows here. So I think, but yes, certainly having sort of baking that institutional knowledge in, ultimately though, when I walk out the door, this goes with me. And, that's the nature of the beast. In fact, one time actually, I think it was at Thule, the non-compete agreement says that contacts, connections, and relationships that I build while I'm here remain with the company when I leave. And I said, so.
From an IBM standpoint, this is where I think we're bad. We're speaking his wife's time out.
Anybody got a quarter?
From an IBM standpoint, this is one area where size is a benefit. Size is not always a benefit, right? So we have a whole community of an organization that is just in place that is huge inside IBM to manage these kinds of relationships. So we have a community that shares. More than that, we have, when somebody in a leadership position moves on, we generally are trying to be very careful that we'll have a significant amount of turnover time. We try and avoid a push-pull scenario. So there'll be turnover where you try and transfer as much of your knowledge and experience and your relationships to the person who's succeeding.
Ballpark for the turnover overlap time. What's
Month.
the ballpark? Month. Okay.
Other questions?
Andy? Could Andy answer that question too?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
You know, I think from an Oracle perspective, you know, we're a matrix organization, as you have 80,000 people. It's a matrix organization. There's a lot of different lines of business. Each of them have alliance professionals in them. Many of them supporting the same partner that my team is responsible for. I'm in a position where I can't dictate to anybody in that matrix organization, but what I can do is set a tone for how we work with SIs. I can set a strategy that I can sell to each of these individuals in terms of many of the things we talked about this evening. And, you know, what we do is we try and make sure that we can provide the means to measure alliances so that there's a lot of inherent quality that's brought to the alliance by the metrics that you place on the success of that alliance. So we try to bring the strategy, the metrics to support that, and we make sure that we are as open and collaborative as we possibly can, certainly internally, around what's required to support a particular partner. And
I see what you mean now. I don't like that.
So that would be my answer. I know I'm not answering the question directly. You don't have the same level of process that Larry described, but what we can do is, you know, we have to win through influence.
I think it's transition, you know, I've been in situations where it's longer than a month. It's been like 2 or 3 months, and gone as far as letting the partner interview the next candidate to be the successor, and that there's buy-in on, you know, who the next person's going to be that's going to help you.
Thanks.
Some more questions. Could you talk a little bit more about what are some of those metrics besides revenue that makes the partnership?
There's a lot of flavors of revenue. And Mark joked most because we do put a lot of time into measure different elements of revenue. But what we do is make sure that we both understand each other's metrics for success. And there are metrics in there that aren't revenue-based, but the main ones outside of revenue are really around solutions, around the initiatives, how many solutions, you know, are we going to bring to market, you know, setting some targets around those things. And then also enablement is a third one, right? And that's what supports the goals of it. So, you know, a lot of enablement metrics as well. So those are the main categories, revenue, different sorts of revenue, you know, solutions and initiatives, and then enablement.
What would enablement metrics look like?
Number of people trained, certified, assessed, you know, those kinds of things. And a lot of it's online today, so it's actually a lot easier to do, and we provide a lot of online training. But there's also things that we might do specifically around initiative where we want to go and target a number of salespeople on each side. So those kinds of things.
Got time for one more question, Norma?
I have a question on the metrics aspect because actually we just did a compensation study where we went into a lot of the metrics now. Managers are focused on that. But to what extent, you said you were aware of each other's metrics, to what extent are your teams actually pulled and measured on partners all reaching metrics and not just specifically on your company doing your number, but also the partners getting, you know, breakthrough numbers and the leverage they're trying to do?
At the alliance level, let me go back one page. When we talk about joint initiatives and solutions in the marketplace, how I measure and pay the business development people on my team is you can have the subjective, are we making progress against the timelines and the actions, but the objective measurements are revenue-based, they're pipeline-based, in terms of opportunity pipeline, and they are reference account-based. Do we have we close deals and can we reference them? We have a measure of success between our two companies. So the services guys and my team are measured on how much of the Oracle's application software license revenue have we influenced. They're not paid on, but they're measured on. We're not in this relationship. Maybe there are others who are, but this relationship, we do not pay our field sales force or anybody on revenues associated with Oracle. It's IBM's revenues associated with Oracle.
Yeah, I know as a small vendor working with PwC in the past, what is that? And we clearly knew what the PwC metrics were, and from an alliance point of view on our side, measured our success, not only based upon how well we were doing, but how well they were doing against their metric. Because ultimately, if PwC isn't happy with their success, then the relationship fails. So you have to be aware of the other person's metric and try and hopefully share it.
Okay, I think we're running a little bit late, and we need to close up. The panelists hopefully will stay by a few more minutes, so people who had more questions might come up in front and ask them. But I want to thank you all for the great questions that you had, and I want to thank Michael, Larry, Andy, and Donna for a really enlightening discussion. I've learned a lot, and I appreciate it very much.